Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this episode 6 of this podcast. Today, I am joined again by Dr. Bonnie.
Hello, Emily. It's wonderful to be welcomed back.
Yeah, thank you. She has been helping me out with this podcast and is sponsoring my project. No, not sponsoring.
Well, sponsoring is actually a good word. I'm mentoring the honors
Yes.
project, so I will gladly be called a sponsor.
Thank you. All right, today we are going to talk about the American socio-political perspective of Russia and the United States, as well as in the context of the Russia-Ukraine war.
Excellent. I can't wait to dive in.
Me too. So the questions we're going to focus on today, or the question is, why did the GOP shift from
The Reagan era sort of Cold War.
should we? Because that's not the main question.
Okay, do we want to start over?
Could we?
Yeah.
All right, let's begin with talking about why the GOP shifted from the Reagan-era Cold War stance toward friendly relationships with Russia amidst evidence of election interference.
What a great question.
So today we're going to be using and referencing two books, the first being President's Populism and the Crisis of Democracy, written by William G. Howell and Terry M. Moe.
Our second book that we will be referencing today is Jesus and John Wayne, How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation by Kristen Kobes-Dumez.
Both very interesting books. If you are interested, definitely check those out.
Absolutely.
First, let's talk about the rise of several intermingling ideologies. So first, like the book we're talking about, is Christian nationalism, which was brought about by evangelical Christians.
Yes, so Kobes-Dumez in Jesus and John Wayne takes a very detailed history, which we will not go into at this time, but it is a really important look because Christian nationalism is a couple of things at once. It is a focused Christianity as a state religion, and it is also looking at a nation's first, like putting your nation first above the global community. And we see this especially espoused by evangelicals who saw the cause for America as a holy war and had espoused certain beliefs about right to choose, abortion, etc. And in the 80s, we start to see this shift in the GOP from a less culturally situated position towards one that directly aligned with evangelicals. And so that's where we see the Christian nationalism piece come in.
Yeah, definitely. In Howell and Moe, it talks about how during that time, that shift in the Republican Party, really there were topics that were chosen to be the topics like the Republican Party would stand for, and the Christianity greatly influenced it, and that's kind of the start of when the Republican Party, not as we know it today because it has still changed, but it began its journey towards that place.
Mm-hmm.
So one thing that we should focus on is populism. So this is populism is very relevant today, as we see with with President Donald Trump.
Mm-hmm.
And these white voters, these evangelical Christians, are a big part of his base. Generally, as talks about in with Howell and Moe, it talks about how these make up his base of voters. And
right.
These are the people that feel threatened by immigration, especially lower socioeconomic level. White, especially male Christian, it tends to be because they feel threatened by immigration and the evolution and progress society is making, because they feel it puts them at a lower level in society, and they are insecure that they have lost the level of privilege, you could say, that they once had.
Correct. Well, and Kobes-Dumez expands on that by saying that despite a lot of popular opinion about this disenfranchised white working class, she noted that most evangelicals who voted for Donald Trump were securely middle class. And I think that in the suburbs where we live here in Illinois, we've seen that play out, is that there were a lot of very wealthy suburbs that voted for Donald Trump, and that it was a fear, like you noted, of being displaced, of losing a privileged status as a white middle or working class American and having cultural cachet over minoritized folks.
Yeah, definitely. I thought, like, going off of that, what was really interesting is that what Howell and Mo talk about is that the Republican Party did not all support Trump, especially in the beginning. Trump was kind of like, honestly, like, he seemed like a joke to them. Like, no one thought that he would win. But because Trump was able to secure his base, his populist base of voters, which that means that those voters wanted a strong man that could fix everything, and he's going to champion their needs, and he is the answer, and that is exactly how Trump ran. So even though the majority or like Republican elite didn't agree with him, Trump was able to gain the support of this white, not all white, but generally white male base, and that's what allowed him to win in the Republican Party, because there was no other candidate that was strong enough and had a strong enough base to overtake Trump in that aspect.
Correct. And that leads us then to talking about hypermasculinity and authoritarianism as another ideology that absolutely affected this rise and shift for the GOP. That we have, and this is something that Cobes Dumez talks about all throughout, is that Donald Trump was a feature, not a bug.
Mm-hmm.
That he was the fulfillment of this authoritarianism, that this is not an accident. And there was this desire to have this strong man, as you mentioned, and Donald Trump embodied that sort of hyper-masculine, rough and tumble, we're going to shoot these people up. You know, I could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and nobody would say anything.
Yeah.
Like, that is an embodiment of this hyper-masculine and authoritarian mindset.
Definitely. And as we see, the Republican Party, even though they didn't agree with him in the beginning, they ended up following because he was the one who had the support in the voters. So even Republicans that didn't necessarily like him in the beginning ended up voting for him because he was Republican on the ballot, which goes into polarization, which we will go into a little bit later. But this is how we see populism start to take over the Republican Party, and how even non-populists have sort of become populist because Trump is the leader and he is the one who championed that.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So moving on, we see that, talking a little bit more about Donald Trump specifically, many think that, like many Democrats who don't like Trump are just like, oh, he's an idiot, he can't do this, like he's just, running his mouth. But in the books mentioned, it actually talks about that Trump specifically used racist and xenophobic words and statements like on purpose, because that's how he knew he could gain the base.
Absolutely. If you think about the history and trajectory of Donald Trump, he's always been an opportunist.
Yeah.
That he was a public fixture in New York for a long time. He identified as a Democrat in the 80s, but he still wrote a letter about the exonerated five demanding that they be executed.
Mm-hmm.
So he's always had the racism there. And even in his years on The Apprentice, where we saw him as this real estate mogul, business mogul,
mm-hmm.
that there were rumors of him saying the N-word on set. That's never been verified, but it's, again, not surprising. And so there's things that have always been there, but then he created a shift in 2011 when he started espousing the birther theory against President Barack Obama, and that signaled to other populists who were resentful and feeling bitter that this is our guy.
Yeah, definitely. As you said, he was able to champion all of that insecurity and take it and run with the power, and he is an opportunist and will do what he wants.
Absolutely.
To get power. So moving a little bit more towards the Ukraine and Russia conflict and Donald Trump and Russia, Trump has shown a lot of admiration for Putin, Vladimir Putin, president of Russia, which it is important to note that he is an authoritarian, not a populist.
Correct.
As identified by Howell and Mo. So knowing this, it's interesting that Trump has this close relationship, you could say, with Russia and Putin when Russia is a enemy of the United States.
Absolutely. And again, when we think about the history of the United States and Russia, Trump was very much a direct opposition to established Republican foreign policy regarding
Mm-hmm.
Russia. You know, the Republicans have long prided themselves on being the party of Reagan, and Reagan himself was famous for saying, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. So
Yeah.
to have such a dramatic turnaround and have an American president who is sharing things with the leader of a country with all sorts of human rights
Mm-hmm.
atrocities and authoritarian issues. It's stunning.
Yeah, and we see this in the Mueller report. So the Mueller report investigated Trump's and people in his campaign and part of his family, their connection,
Yeah,
and like possibly sharing information with Russia. However, the report Mueller never what do you say suggested in court that he just gave that Trump was involved. He gave the information, and so this
correct.
may have, well, it did impact the way that Congress ruled, because it he didn't take a position, and that's an interesting topic. Like, why did he do that?
Well, right, especially because he himself was also a Republican, also a long time, he'd been the director of the FBI, like a longtime public servant, and it was typical for a special investigator to make a ruling. Now, we also have to note that the reason there was a special investigator instead of the Attorney General is that the Attorney General himself had to recuse himself because of his own contact with Russia.
Yeah,
So we
it's
had the deputy director of the Attorney General's office, who then appointed Mr. Mueller as special counsel. It
mhm.
is staggering.
Yeah, just the entire thing, and moving also looking at with Ukraine, Trump asked Ukraine to investigate uh, President Biden, or Vice President at the time, Vice President Biden and his son,
Hmm.
as well as investigate. He wanted Ukraine to investigate that they had interfered in the election and not Russia.
Correct. Well, I don't know why any country would agree to that.
And he actually, yeah, he withheld. I think it was,
It's foreign
excuse
aid.
me, yeah, excuse me if I'm wrong. I think it was 400 million, or it was a large sum of money, um, and aid, yeah, to Ukraine.
Correct, unless they would investigate Hunter Biden.
Mm-hmm.
And it is illegal and unethical to withhold unconditional aid to a country in exchange for goods rendered to you. That's what we call the quid pro quo.
Mm-hmm.
And so this became apparent through a whistleblower, and there was evidence also in the Mueller report of this leading up to it. So this led to Trump being impeached the
Mm-hmm.
first time in his first term, his only term so far. And this is a clear violation of American foreign policy and international ethics.
Yeah, and his lack of transparency and like the blocking of the investigation and like refusal to give information is a direct undermining of democracy. And Trump's outright lies and disinformation that he has championed is a direct threat to democracy, and it should be treated as such.
Correct. Well, and I think we also have to go over then thinking about what Trump did to Ukraine in light of the criticism that Barack Obama rightfully received when Russia invaded the Crimea, which is a part of Ukraine, and that Obama was criticized for not taking a stronger approach. And I totally agree with that. I think he should have had a sanction on Russia or something more harsh to send a specific message. And I think the fact that he did not embolden Russia to take the action that they did, which then leads us to our present moment in 2022 when Russia invades Ukraine. Now we have the GOP having to make a decision.
Yeah, as we see, Trump is still pro-Putin, even though he did not win the next second presidential term, and he has reduced social media presence. He is still very pro-Putin, and he says that Putin or Russia has he does not condemn the invasion of Ukraine.
Correct. He provided some sort of weird justification for it on his limited social
Yeah.
media presence. And, you know, again, the GOP, who has historically been the party of freedom, but then being the party of Trump, they are having to sort of flip and flop their decision. And so now We have members of Congress who are split as to whether or not we should be providing aid to Ukraine. We have the establishment Republicans who say yes, but then we have this newer populist base who's aligned with the Republican Party who is virulently, again, Christian nationalist and xenophobic, saying no, we shouldn't.
Yeah, this is very important with the current situation in Ukraine. They've been able to get some aid from NATO and the United States, but there has been no military intervention. It is still a very, like, there's still no way to know how the war is going to play out.
Correct. Well, and then we're coming up to the 2022 midterm elections, and Kevin McCarthy, the House Minority Leader, has signaled as of a week ago, as of this recording, that if the Republicans take back the House, they will plan to end all aid to the Ukraine. And again, we don't know if that's going to change, but I think we're seeing a lot of international anxiety. If the GOP takes the House and potentially the Senate again, what is going to happen next? That this could lead to a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen to our aid to Ukraine.
And what does that mean for just democracy? If we are not aiding Ukraine, who is a democratic country, against Russia, who, as Putin is known to be authoritarian, just what does that mean for democracy and for the United States? Like, that's a complete shift in the United States, like, rhetoric and belief, like core beliefs.
Absolutely. And it's also a really drastic shift in our foreign policy. You know, during World War I, we had Woodrow Wilson, also xenophobic, also racist, who pursued a very aggressive isolationist policy until 1918, when we entered the very tail end of World War I. And so in essence, you know, and for good or for bad, and then that can be another podcast discussion for a different topic at another time.
Yeah.
So we can always debate the merits of whether or not we get involved in other people's conflicts, but we have had a history of providing aid to support democracies around the world and prevent human rights atrocities. And Putin has clearly committed some of those atrocities, and his invasion of Ukraine is not warranted, and he is relying on the compliance of his people. So the GOP is going to have to ask themselves, what do I really believe in, whether or not Donald Trump believes in it? And I think there's going to have to be a lot of soul searching on that account.
Definitely. So as we conclude this podcast, we'll look towards the future and see what happens in this upcoming election, and see what happens with Congress and the presidential response to it. There is no way to know what will happen, but personally, I hope that we do give aid to Ukraine and help our fellow democracy during this time. Thank you for being here today, Dr. Bonnie.
Thank you for inviting me again.
And tune in next time for another podcast, and be sure to listen to the interviews that we have featured. I have featured Ukrainian perspectives, Russian perspectives, as well as people who lived under communism or the Soviet Union. So stay tuned to listen for that. Thank you.